2000s or today, I think you could probably do really well. You know, maybe something more like an 80s theme, where you have a hero that is really bright and chivalrous, and maybe in some ways I'm actually just talking about the Sean Bean character in Game of Thrones. I just realized that. I'm sorry. Anyway, the point is, I think you could really make, maybe I haven't thought this through 100%, and as with many points in the Weekly Ringer, there are times when I'm kind of thinking out loud. But I think, at the very least, the point I'm trying to make is that if you're going to start a fantasy series, you're going to make it like Game of Thrones, and that's why I would say it is going to be right up there at the top of the list, if not the best series, fantasy series of all time. Even though many of you made a very good point, and I'll move on to this now very briefly, that it's very difficult to divide up fantasy. Point taken, guys. There's a lot of sci-fi that probably looks more like fantasy, and vice versa. I know that as a category on Netflix, I often shake my fist in the air at Netflix. Okay, maybe not literally, but sometimes I want to just scream, because Netflix has sci-fi and fantasy together. And so when I go to look for a fantasy movie and I end up seeing things like The Matrix, it just drives me crazy, right? I mean, I'm not saying The Matrix isn't a fantasy movie, but The Matrix is a sci-fi movie if it's anything, right? It's not a fantasy, what we think of as a traditional fantasy kind of story. I know technically it probably is a fantasy story. It gets to the same level as a lot of the things I've mentioned here, but it doesn't really fit the bill of what I'm trying to point at. So you guys talked about a lot of different genres. I think they're all legitimate, but I like my sword and sorcery. I like my spellage. I like the way that, it's kind of almost like swashbuckling and maybe not necessarily medieval or Middle Ages or Dark Ages, or just the sword and sorcery. That's the stuff that really gets me going. That's why I like it. That's why I ever even would have imagined picking up something like Dungeons and Dragons. I just love that kind of stuff. And I'm not saying it's not cool in other kinds of settings. That's just what I like and what I think is the best. All right, so that wraps up the question from last week. Now it's time to ask the question for next week moving forward. I actually had an interesting conversation just this week in which someone didn't know, and I'm not going to say that this is terrible, but someone didn't know who John Williams was. And I was really taken aback by that, because I thought everybody knew who John Williams was, whether you were a geek or not, whether you study film scores or not, whether you really love movie music or not. I really didn't think it mattered. I thought everybody knew who John Williams was. Well, turns out I was wrong. And so it got me thinking about John Williams and his tremendous contribution. I happen to be a patron of the symphony in the area that I live here, and I really do enjoy classical music. I like scoring. I like music for films. I like all those things. And it started really making me, the group that's here in my local area does a lot of pops music with John Williams, and a lot of times it's looked down upon and so on and so forth. And that can be a separate question altogether for another Weekly Ringer in another course of time. But here's the question that arose for me as I started thinking about all the great contributions of somebody like John Williams in film, and how it's opened up a lot of things in games as well. And it has, right? And I can ask the equivalent for video games some other time, but it's worth noting that a lot of the great scores from films have opened up a lot of scores into the video games, and that has become a staple, as we see from a lot of games like the new Legend of Zelda, which is going to have a fully orchestrated score. I want to ask you this week about this. What is the best John Williams score for a film, right? So what is and you can just talk about the movie, that's fine. So what movie has the best John Williams score in it? And there are so many to choose from, guys. And before you say which one you think it is, by the way, please go to like Wikipedia or go some site or something and look at the full list, because it will shock you. It will downright shock you how many movies John Williams has done the music for. And I think it'll also shock you how many movies that maybe you didn't even think he did the music for, he actually did. So, do me a favor, go look at that list, then tell me what the best John Williams score for a movie has ever been. That's the question for next week on the Weekly Ringer. Thanks for spending some time outdoors with me here on the Weekly Ringer. I can't wait to see what you guys come up with for next week. Thanks for watching as always. I am the Commodore from the clan of the Gray Wolf, and there is no reset button. It's getting dark.